Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Ranger Pat Riley with Fire Island National Seashore, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background. That I want to tell you that in 2014, an email went around the park employees asking for participants in a project that was going on with the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, looking for indoor-outdoor cats to be part of a study. So I have to tell you, my cat was part of your study. This is
Starbucks
off of his special paparazzi page, and this is his track. So this is just a really small piece of what you do. So I'm very, very happy to introduce Dr. Roland. He's a zoologist with the North Carolina State University and North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences.
Great.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Well, cool. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. If you can't hear me in the back, move forward, please, because we're not going to do a mic, but you're nodding, so that means you can hear me, hopefully. So it's an honor to be here and to speak in such a cool venue. This is definitely the coolest place I've ever spoke. I don't think I've ever given a talk with my sunglasses on, so that's kind of cool. I'm going to be talking today about coyotes. I think I'll probably talk for about a half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And I'm going to tell a story, the story of coyotes starting way back, like 10,000 years ago, because I think it's important to know where the coyotes have come from. And we're going to end right here and right now with what's going on with coyotes right here, even with some data that was collected by the seashore here earlier this year on coyotes. So that's kind of the what we're going to do in like half an hour. So I want to start going back like 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, the Pleistocene, right? There's no humans here, but there were coyotes in North America, not here in New York, but there were coyotes in North America. They were in the western United States, and they were coexisting with like mastodons, mammoths, right? Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant ground sloths. It was there were all these megafauna there at the time. And the point I want to make is coyotes were like a pretty small predator, right? They were what we call a mesopredator. And the important things about being a mesopredator is you are also prey, right? If you're a top predator, all you got to worry about is hunting something. But if you're a mesopredator, you got to worry about hunting and getting your food. But you also got to worry about looking out for something that's bigger than you. And so I think it's important to realize that that's where coyotes came from, because it's going to come into play when we think about the relationship that we have with coyotes today. So coyotes and wolves survived what's known as the Pleistocene megafauna extinction. That's when the mastodons, the mammoths, the giant ground sloths, they all went extinct about 10 or 12,000 years ago, relatively suddenly, at just about the time when humans first came across the Bering Land Bridge from Asia into Alaska, down into North America. They were very sophisticated hunters. They had spears. They were cooperative, and they were a big part of why a lot of these megafauna went extinct. But the coyote and the wolf and the mountain lion and the white-tailed deer, right? All these animals that we see today were survivors of that time period. But at this time, the coyote was still in the western United States. It was a grassland, desert animal. If you look at fossil records, which we've done, and you look at where were the fossils of coyotes, it's all out west. It's not out here at the east at all. We had wolves here, but there were no coyotes. Okay, so now let's move forward a little bit when kind of European colonists came over, and they came over with just a hatred of wolves and all predators, right? The big bad wolf, Little Red Riding Hood, the Three Little Pigs, and they just exterminated the wolves. They also had sheep that they liked to just let wander around. They didn't like take care of them very much, right? They just kind of let them out into the woodland, and so of course the wolf's going to kill them, the sheep, if they're just wandering around, right? And so the colonists, early Americans, right, our ancestors, wiped out wolves and mountain lions and a lot of other predators. Oh, look out! That was exciting. There's another chair over here.
I really wiped out.
I said wiped out, and they almost wiped away.
Okay.
So wolves used to be here. We drove them out to near extinction in the lower 48 states, right? They survived in Alaska and Canada. In the lower 48 states, they survived in the Great Lakes, Minnesota, very northern Wisconsin, a little bit of very northern Michigan. In the 1950s, that's the only place you could find wolves in the United States, gray wolves in the United States, was up in that area. And what's interesting is coyotes started moving into that area. And around this time, actually it was probably a little before this, there was an event that was really important to your coyotes that you have here today that happened in Minnesota probably about 100 years ago, maybe 200 years ago. And this kind of thing happens when one species gets really rare and the other species is more common. So imagine the wolves, we're killing all the wolves. There's hardly any wolves left. There's a female wolf that comes into heat, and there's no male wolves around. So she takes the next best thing she could get. She breeds with a coyote, right? The kind of thing that sort of might happen amongst humans in bars late at night or something, right? Sort of like, okay, what's the next best option I have? And so there were lots of coyotes running around, and so they bred together, and they had fertile offspring, right? That can happen sometimes. Usually, if they're different species, they don't often breed together. They don't want to, right? The female wolf didn't want to breed with the male coyote, but she couldn't find any other wolves because we killed them all. And so they had a litter that would have been 50-50, half coyote, half wolf genes, just like you are half your mom and half your dad. They're the same species in that case, right? In this case, they're going to be half and half. And those offspring, then some of them bred with wolves. There were still some wolves around. And we know that because if you look at the wolves in Minnesota today, they have some coyote genes in them. Not very many, but a little bit, maybe 5%. And you can actually age and say, okay, that happened a couple hundred years ago, roughly, is when that happened. So that's kind of interesting. But what's more important for when we're thinking about the wolves in New York, or the coyotes in New York, is that some of those litters, some of those animals, cross back into the coyotes. So you had an animal that was 50 wolf, 50% coyote, bred with that animal, bred with the coyote. So now it's 25% wolf, 75% coyote. And that bred with another coyote, so now you're down to like 12%. And that's the animal, 8%, that suddenly started moving east really quickly. So they were like, somehow those wolf genes helped them adapt to humans and adapt to move east pretty quickly. And so if you look at the expansion of the East Coast, and I've got a really nice graphic that I'm not showing you, but there's this map that you can see where coyotes move east. They were only in the west, and they steadily move east. And in the southeast, they move pretty slowly. They didn't have any genes. It took them a long time to get across Ohio and Tennessee. But in the northeast, they practically sprinted across Ontario and into upstate New York. By 1950, there were coyotes in upstate New York. They started in 1921. The first coyote entered Ontario in 1921. So they moved very quickly. And these were the ones that had wolf genes. And somewhere along the lines, another one of these special events happened. And I don't know exactly where, but I like to think that maybe it was when the first coyote that had some wolf genes crossed the St. Lawrence River, right? And so now you have the same situation. There's a coyote, a female, it's springtime, mating season. There's no other coyotes around because it's like the lead coyote, right? It's the first one to cross some barrier like the St. Lawrence Seaway. But what was running around probably in the 1950s that she might have been able to breed with? It's in the same genus, dogs. And so we see today the evidence of that, right? So we know that happened because we see dog genes in the coyotes. And we know it was a female coyote and a male dog, or probably multiple male dogs, and it probably happened a few times, because in the DNA, there's something called the mitochondrial DNA that's only passed down from your mothers. That's all coyote. The first paper I did was just mitochondrial DNA, and we're like, oh, there's no dog hybridization. And then we looked at the nuclear DNA, and we're like, oh my God, holy cow, look at all this dog hybridization. And so what we find today in pretty much all the animals from upstate New York and from New England is about 85% coyote. So they're mostly coyote, genetic-wise. 5 to 10% dog, and 5 to 10% wolf. So they're a mixture of all those genes. And different animals will have different amounts of each of those. And sometimes you see funny colored animals. You see black coyotes, or dark coyotes or really pale coyotes or really long-haired, shaggy-haired coyotes. And that's just the genes are shuffling, and they happen to get probably a weird dog gene that happens to be recessive or dominant in that situation, and you get that kind of result. And so you see that way more in the east than you do in the west, where they're all sort of more purebred coyotes. And so that's the animal that you have that's here. It's mostly coyote. It's got a little bit of wolf, a little bit of dog mixed in. We know actually that the wolf genes are responsible in part for making eastern coyotes larger than western coyotes. So eastern coyotes are about 10 pounds heavier. Western coyotes on average are average 25 pounds. Eastern coyotes average 35 pounds. They can get bigger. Anyone who's ever who's seen a coyote with their own eyes? Okay? If you have a dog, you're like, oh, that coyote was like 50, 60, 70 pounds because it's bigger than my dog. And I have a dog who's 50 pounds, and when I see a coyote, I'm like, oh, that's bigger than my dog. It's not true. When you get the animals on a scale, they are 35 pounds, sometimes 45 pounds, like record coyotes, 50 pounds. But that's like 1 in 100 is 50 pounds. So they're just compact. They're just really compact, and so they look way bigger than they are. And if you're like, oh, I have a dog, well, that just doesn't work. I've weighed a lot of coyotes. But what's cool is we've actually done, like, if you look at the genes that came from wolves, and you say, what do these genes do, and why do the coyotes still have them, right? Because the genes could come and go. The ones that are associated with body size are still there in coyotes. And so it seems like the wolves really help the coyotes get bigger, not a lot bigger, but a little bit bigger, and that's helping them. That helped them move faster across Ontario. It's helping them survive better today. And so that's the animal you have. And so let's think about what is it? What do they eat? They eat a lot of different things, right? That's one of the reasons they're so successful is they can eat insects, they can eat fruit, they can eat small mammals, rabbits, and they can eat deer. Now, they're not very good at killing deer, but they can kill deer. But there's so many deer around here, right? They're just like living off the excess. The roadkills, the sick, the injured, and so they can eat deer. And what we find, to grossly oversimplify, is in the western United States, they eat 30% a third rabbit, a third mice, and a third other stuff, fruits and insects and scavenge. And in the eastern United States, they eat a third rabbit also, but a third deer. So they're eating more deer in the east, probably because there's just so many deer that they can. But maybe that's part of why they're a little bit bigger. Maybe that helps them hunt deer a little bit better than western coyotes. We also see them living. So the pack structure of coyotes in the east is the same as it is in the west, which is that there's like a pair that has babies, right? They have babies in the springtime in like April, and those grow up, and then the next year they're going to have another litter, and usually those youngins take off. Sometimes one or two will stick around and help, but not very often. So it's different than wolves, right? Where wolves have the teenagers the next year hang out, sometimes for multiple years, and you have a pack that hunts together cooperatively. Coyotes don't do that. Even when they have a group, they're usually off running by themselves. If you get snow, if you have a chance to go out and follow coyote tracks in the snow, they're almost always by themselves. Sometimes you see two, but you don't see, very rarely do you get the big group. Like, they'll get together to howl, but they don't move together like wolves do. The other really interesting thing about about all these teenagers, is there's all these floaters that are roaming around looking for a territory. That's the teenagers, right? They grow up, they've had their year with their parents kick them out, their dad gets grumpy at them, and so they leave. And they have to find a new territory. But they go next door, there's already another big older male there, and so they can't get in there. And so they end up wandering around a lot. And there was a study in Georgia recently that found 40% of the coyotes were these wanderers. And that's gonna come important at the end of my talk, so I'm gonna come back to that. That's pretty interesting. So finally, they kind of live in all sorts of different habitats, right? They originally were only in grasslands and deserts and woodlands, but now they're really in forests. They do fine in forests. They do fine in this kind of habitat. They're really generalists. And so what I want to kind of move into the second part of the talk is about how now they basically filled up all the habitat in the East, right? They're in every chunk of forest, like in Harlem and the Bronx, and they're, well, so every chunk of forest around Harlem and the Bronx, and now they're moving into the cities, right? There's basically nothing left. And so they're starting to colonize the cities. And so that's where we really run into them, right? And so they're in New York City, they're breeding pairs, but they colonized, we were chatting earlier, probably over the last dozen years. Like New York City is one of the last eastern cities, right? It's furthest east. And so originally when they first showed up in New York, the 1950s, they were up in upstate New York. You know, they worked their way down, but you know, they would go to Sterling Forest or the other bigger natural areas. And eventually, there's a big grumpy male territorial animal in there. And so the young ones have to try something else. And okay, well, you know, maybe I can go into one of these scrappy little urban parks. And, you know, actually a lot of the urban parks have a lot of rabbits and deer. And probably a lot of mice. And sometimes coyotes will eat garbage. They're not very big in that, but they can eat garbage. They also like to eat cat food. So if you're feeding cats outdoors, the coyotes will say thank you for the cat food and then thank you for the cat, right? Because that's one place that we run into conflict with coyotes. So when they kill our cats, and they will kill cats. They definitely kill cats. And if you let your cat outdoors and you have coyotes around, and nowadays almost everyone has coyotes around, free-ranging cats are definitely at risk. It's not a sure thing, but because some cats, you know, some cats are badasses, right? And coyotes can judge that. And if they walk up to a cat and that cat is a big gnarly tomcat with front claws, and you know, they'll be like, all right, you know, maybe not. But there's a lot of cats out there that are pussycats that the coyotes will take out too. So that is one source of conflict, is coyotes killing cats. The other one is coyotes killing dogs. This is something that definitely happens. And this happens more in the western United States, where they're a lot more urban than they are here. And interestingly, it happens mostly with small dogs. And there was actually a survey, a really cool paper that somebody else did that I was like, that's genius. I wish I'd have thought of that. Where they just watched videos on YouTube of coyotes and cats, or coyotes and dogs. And you know, so many people have these security cameras out right in their backyard that there's a lot of these interactions that are recorded. And they found that most interactions between coyotes and dogs are social interactions. They're playing. They're like, hey, you're a friend. Like, yeah, they're just kind of like checking each other out. They're not aggressive. Most of the aggressive ones are with the small dogs. Chihuahuas seem to have no sense of when to shut up. And the coyotes, honestly, the coyotes really go after chihuahuas a lot. There are sort of small dogs that are going to yip a lot. The coyotes, I don't know. I don't think they eat them. I just think it's just like, I don't know. I don't know why. I don't want to try to anthropomorphize too much. You guys can do that on your own. But so there is a risk of coyotes killing dogs. In terms of coyotes' attacks on people, that also sometimes happens. There were some examples last year, 2 years pre-COVID, a couple years ago, of a coyote on Rutgers campus that attacked a couple people. Generally, you hit them on the head and they run away, right? The problem comes if it's a smaller human, like a kid. And so there has been one, maybe two fatalities of people that were killed by coyotes attacking them. But most of the time, if you consider, like, there are thousands of people in the hospital every day from dog attacks, right? The risk of a coyote attack is relatively rare. But the point is, they do sometimes get bold and come up to an urban area, and I've seen that, you know, I subscribe to a Google News alert whenever coyotes make the news, which is every day. So every day I see where they're making the news, and they're making the news whenever they get in trouble. And now that everyone has these security cameras in the background, you know, you see there are some footage of a little girl walking down her backyard, and a coyote comes tearing around, knocks her over, and her like 8-year-old brother chases the coyote away. But it's, you know, that's the kind of thing that can happen. So it is like I love coyotes, but I don't mean to, you know, I don't want to pretend like they're not potentially a problem. If you have a cat that's outdoors, if your cat has been killed by a coyote, that sucks, right? That would be terrible. And you know, small dogs potentially a risk. People, not really. Honestly, I don't think it's such a, compared to all the risks we face on a daily basis. You don't. If you see a coyote, you should be excited. They're usually pretty hard to see. but it kind of brings up the question, to kind of wrap it up, of like, what are we going to do about it? Right? What? Okay, so the first instinct is, let's get rid of the coyotes. But then we come into this 40% floater issue that I talked about. And someone once called this coyote math. It's coyote math. -1 = 4. That's coyote math. If you take out one breeder coyote, 4 floaters come in to try to take its place. And that's really what happens. And so eventually, those 4 sort it out, right? One takes over, they're the new dominant, and that dominant pack will keep those floaters out of that area. You'll have sort of one established pack. But if you're constantly you're constantly causing this social chaos of coyotes where you're removing breeders, you're getting all these floaters coming in. They can come in from hundreds of miles away, literally. And so that's why, like, if you have a problem coyote, right? If you have a problem with attacking people, you should definitely kill that coyote and get rid of it. But if you're just trying to reduce the population, it doesn't work. In fact, like locally, it seems to do the opposite, where it actually attracts coyotes. So we're not going to get rid of coyotes in any sort of preemptive sense. So what I think we need to do is figure out how to change their behavior, right? We need to manage their behavior and make them afraid of us, basically. And so how are we going to do that? So there's kind of 2 options. The one option is hazing, which would be great if it worked. So far, it doesn't seem to work. But the idea is, if you see a coyote, scare it, make it know that oh, don't mess with me. I'm a big nasty human. The problem is when you have a mesopredator like a coyote they're really good at judging risk, right? They can sneak, if a wolf has killed an elk, they can sneak in and grab a bite of that elk in front of that wolf and run away. They can judge that risk, right? And so some of the hazing, people are like, well, get a Mentos can and fill it with coins and shake it to make a loud noise. I'm sorry. Coyotes are not going to be, maybe the first time they hear that, they'll be like, oh, they're going to run away. But they're smart, and they're going to adjust to that, right? And so, people talk about, well, open and shut an umbrella or bang pots and pans together, but like, who wants to walk around on their walk down the beach with pots and pans, right? So I think it's tricky, and there have been a few studies that have shown that hazing doesn't work, but I think we have some more. Like, I think it requires maybe some maybe some paintballs would work, right? They're going to feel a paintball, and that's something that maybe would be a little bit more aggressive. So the other option is to trap them and or shoot them, to kill them. And I think that that does work, right? So if you go into the rural areas, those coyotes are not bold. They don't have a problem with coyotes killing cats in a lot of the rural areas, because there's a lot of coyote hunting. And if a coyote loses their fear of humans, they'll end up getting shot by somebody. But obviously we can't do that in an urban area, right? We can't have people walking around with, in their pulling up in their pickup truck and shooting a coyote in someone's backyard. And we also, so coyotes are really smart. They're really hard to trap. The best way to trap them was with foothold traps, which if you catch someone's dog in a foothold trap, they're not going to be very happy. I mean, the dog will be okay, but so it's tricky, right? And so I still think there's a challenge of, like, as coyotes get more and more urban and they realize all these people walking down the sidewalk every day aren't really a problem to me, they start to get bolder. Maybe bolder isn't the right word, but less afraid of people. Like, that's where maybe they're going to start looking at your little chihuahua or causing sort of other problems. So I think that's kind of a challenge that we still need to face is how do we manage coyote behavior in an urban area? And I see that across the country, mostly in the western states, where coyotes have been a lot longer, and they have higher populations in the cities. And so, cities are starting to adapt these management strategies where they're hiring people to kill coyotes, which some people really hate that idea, right? So, to get a community to agree that we should spend tax money to kill our native wildlife is no small issue. So I think it's kind of a complicated thing. But I think, you know, the great thing about coyotes, wow, I didn't check my notes this whole time, but I'm going to make sure I get my 3 take-home points because I wrote them down. Is one, make sure you don't feed coyotes. I didn't really mention that, but like that's the way that coyotes are going to become habituated the easiest is if they're getting fed, right? And that includes cat food out in the woods for cats because coyotes will eat that. If they start walking into a backyard looking for food because they keep getting food at this site, and then, you know, a 3-year-old toddles by, you know, that's in their prey size, and that's where you can kind of get problems. I think, you know, how to keep them shy in urban areas is still kind of a challenge, but I think some degree of hunting and trapping is part of the solution, not with a goal of trying to reduce their population, because I don't think that will ever work, but with the goal of sort of managing their behavior, trying to keep them shy. So that's the end of my talk, and hopefully you guys have some questions. We can get some questions.